Tonight we have a treat. We have Ann Willyard is visiting us from the West Coast, and she's going to give us some information. Well, she's going to talk about our scientific names. She, let's see here. We're going to talk about plant names from a user's perspective, much like how most of us want to learn how to drive, but only specialists need to learn how to design and build an automobile. So her information is based on a book by the same name that she has self-published on Amazon. So you'll be able to look for it there. Anne has taught botany and plant systematics at Hendrix College in Arkansas. She has her PhD from Oregon State. She's published and collaborated on botanical research papers and is an associate editor of the American Journal of Botany. She grew up as the fourth generation working a small cattle ranch in the oak woodlands of Northern California and was fortunate to spend many of her family vacations horsepacking into the Trinity Alps of Northern California. That's one I haven't heard of. She currently lives in Oregon, nearer to her children and grandchildren. She has a webpage at isegreen.net. So, Latin names, learn to love those Latin names is the name of her book. So Anne, welcome to the Tennessee Native Plant Society. We have these seminars once a month. Members from across the state tend to join in and learn a little something more about some aspect of our native plants. So without ado, I am going to turn it over to you, Anne, and we will hold questions until you are finished, and then we will ask away with questions, if that's okay.
Perfect.
All right, the floor is yours, Anne.
Thank you for the introduction, Karen. So learn to love those Latin names. I will say that my webpage is under construction. It's being self-constructed, and that's not something that's my favorite thing to do, so that project gets pushed aside. A straightforward guide to botanical nomenclature. And I think that's funny to say straightforward and botanical nomenclature in the same phrase. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Get back to there. So welcome to you all. And I know that I have a lot of different levels of expertise in the audience. Those of you who are just considering yourselves beginners, I want to tell you before we get started that the dictionary definition of botanist is an expert in or a student of the scientific study of plants. So I consider each and every one of you a botanist. And as you already know, it's a slippery slope from being an enthusiast to being a botanical citizen scientist. And so what I'm going to do today is give you some information that I think will further your enjoyment of recognizing plant species. You know, the idea that you go along a walk and or in your garden and you can call the species by name is pleasurable the same way knowing your friends' names is a pleasure. And I want to help you see that the ground in between the ivory tower, I'm not going to tell you there's not an ivory tower of botanists, but there's a lot of ground in between. And I actually, in addition to academics, have a long history with native plant societies and love them dearly. And I really do think that you'll be able to go out and see more of the green. So after I retired, I'd been wanting to do this for a while, and I couldn't find any public publisher, to be honest, that even had the time to talk to me about submitting a manuscript. And so I decided to use Amazon's KDP self-published. And so, you know, there are still some things that I would like to improve on that. I'll probably do a second version. That is a challenge, not having someone else do it, but it's available right away in both paperback and Kindle edition. And I would welcome your feedback on any suggestions you have for that. So let's dive into the agenda. So first of all, I'm going to try to convince you why to use botanical nomenclature, which of course is a very fancy way of saying scientific names of plants. I think there are important reasons why it's useful to use the scientific names. And then I'm going to give you some information on how to use those names. And so even if you're experienced, you might find some tidbits there that will help, and then some suggestions on where to learn more. So let's get started. Why not just use common names? And I want to stop here and say this book and my talk about it are not arguments to abandon common names. And I know people who love what they consider to be the right name, and that can be something your dad taught you when you were a child. And I'll give you an example of that. It could be a tribal name. And so I don't think it's disrespectful to learn the universal scientific name. And that allows us to talk to people in other languages and people whose dads taught them other common names. So let's talk about the problems with common names so that when you're using them, you understand what's going on. So you know that common names are local, and that same name is used for different species in different places, right? So one common name could be completely duplicated for a completely different plant. I'll give you some examples. They're not standard. There are many different names for the same species. And that is if you were a database person instead of a one-to-many, that's a many-to-many problem. And so translating one common name to another, especially across languages, is insurmountable, really. There are also many species that have no common name. So if you add all of those problems together, and then you multiply that, or probably an exponent by that, there are 386,000 species of vascular plants. And so the common names only is really a problematic and gets in the way of a lot of useful discussions. So here's an example. This is in English and common names for the different species. So this one on the left, the dodecathions, grow, and they are the first wildflower to bloom in Northern California, Mediterranean climate, where spring actually starts about February. And my dad called these Johnny Jump Ups, and he wasn't the only one. He'd heard it from someone. And my dad knew a common name for every plant on the ranch and the places he traveled. And I had a cute little how to use flowers in food book that I picked up somewhere. And I saw Johnny Jump Ups in a recipe, and I flipped over to the page. And because these were not edible, I never heard of anyone eating the dodecathions. And I found out what I just had not known before, that in England, the viola tricolors are called Johnny Jump Ups for the same reason that we in Northern California called these Johnny Jump Ups, because they're one of the earliest blooming wildflowers. So Johnny Jump Ups, same name applied to two very different plants. And here's how the many-to-many relationship comes in. So even in Northern California, most of my neighbors actually call these shooting stars. But if you look up some other Wikipedia type translations, other people call those same species American cowslips, mosquito bills, mad violets, and sailor caps, right? And let's just be clear too, that's only everything in the genus Dodecathion. There's really no common name for each of the species. And so, for example, there may be Jeffrey's shooting star, and et cetera. And then in viola tricolor, some of the common names that are in use are Heart's Ease, but spelled either with no space, with an apostrophe, or Heart's Delight, which is similar, but not the same if you're searching for it. Tickle My Fancy, Jack Jump Up and Kiss Me, I like that one a lot. Come and Cuddle Me, Three Faces in a Hood, Love and Idleness, Pink of My John. So that's just English, and quite a problem if that's the only name you're using. Here's one that you may not have heard about before, but it's actually kind of a strange one. So way back to Linnaeus' time, there was a misuse of the name yucca. And so the yucca in Latin name here is Spanish daggers or Joshua tree, and it's in the Asparagaceae or lily family. And there was a confusion way back that this Manihot esculenta, which you should probably know as cassava, was called yucca in some of the languages in the places in the tropics where that's a really important carbohydrate. Now, cassava, yucca in some languages, has cyanide in it. And so it's a really useful carbohydrate, but only when it's properly cooked. Now, in North America, some tribes, mostly when there were not other things available, would dig the root of the yucca that's native to North America and eat it. So I will tell you that if you go to an American grocery store and you see something labeled yucca root, it will be this one. But if you go to Wikipedia and search how to cook a yucca, Y-U-C-C-A, you will find at least some goofy recipes from someone, a hippie like myself, who wants to know how the natives in North America cook this one. And those are not the same plants. And so there's other yuccas that are edible in other ways. Here's one from the Southeast that you might know that has edible fruit, as long as you don't eat the seeds. So there's a confusion that having the scientific name, which you're going to see hidden in here, Manihot esculenta and Yucca treculiana and Yucca filamentosa, can be an important way to translate. Had a crossword puzzle not too long ago that said Spanish moss or nori. Had me stumped for a while. So you probably know that nori is the seaweed that we use for sushi or red algae. Spanish moss is a flowering plant. It's not a moss at all. And Irish moss is a flowering plant, not a moss at all. But there is an Irish moss that's a red algae. So it turns out that the crossword answer was seaweed, which was actually wrong. It should have been nori or Irish moss. But the important point here is that, and I want to make this especially to those of you who are naturalists, give walks and things, the reminds me of problem can seem helpful, but when you call things a moss that are not a moss, it's really helpful to have newbies brought into perspective, right? It is really not helpful to people learning to identify a moss when they see these flowers on it, right? Because that's not what mosses do. And there's a way, though, that Latin names help you with this reminds me of, which is really a great way to learn, right? This reminds me of something else that helps us make that connection. The scientific name for Spanish moss is Tillandsia usneoides. The usneoides means it reminds me of usnea, the lichen. So not a moss at all, not a flowering plant, but the way Spanish moss hangs from the trees reminds us of the lichen usnea. And so the fact that we use this as part of the epithet part of the name, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is a really useful way. And I'll give you the example of the stinging nettles. There are a lot of things with urticaceae as part of the epithet, which means the leaf shape reminds me of the stinging nettles. So reminds me of is helpful, but let's be thoughtful about where we use it. Here's a great way, though, that scientific names can help. So there is one name for each species, and we may not all agree in all cases. There are things being revised, but the way the rule is written, you don't have to agree with what someone else thinks, but each treatment is only allowed to consider one name for each species. It's always in Latin regardless of alphabet. So if you think it's tough for us, think about someone who's got Cyrillic or katakana or Arabic, I mean, some of the other scripts. You will find in their publications, as in this example from a Slovene guidebook, of the treatment and description in whatever language, and then the Latin. And here's an example. This was a foreign exchange student of mine from Slovenia. And when we visited, he and his family, I picked up this little guidebook. And of course, you'll notice that it's written not in a Cyrillic script, but in Slovene. And here is the Latin name, Ruscus, I can't quite read that, Aculeatus and Fritillaria orientalis. And so I was able to enjoy the pictures and recognize the Latin names. So another language, but using Latin around the world. And in fact, publications everywhere do this, no matter the country. So pronunciation. I want to make sure you know that there really is no official right or wrong way to pronounce Latin. And the Jepson Manual of California, a couple of decades ago, in the introduction, they included a couple of statements that recommended that if someone corrects your pronunciation of a Latin name, a knowing look would be the best response. In other words, there are some rules, but you're never wrong. You're never wrong. So the recommendation is say each syllable and each diphthong. So for example, with diphthongs, for the family name suffix, which we'll talk about later, ACE, which is very intimidating, most botanists say ACE, so just ACE. If you say that some other way, you're not wrong. It's just maybe you'll recognize ACE when you hear it, and you'll certainly recognize it in writing. There's actually two choices for the accent, and here's an example using this word hydrophyllum. So technically, and I'm not going to go into the rules, and the reason I'm not is they're actually quite complicated grammatically. The correct place is the accent on the third from the last syllable with a soft English O. So if the person who's teaching you a class and giving you a grade says hydrophyllum, I recommend you say hydrophyllum. And that's what I say because a person who taught me taxonomy said hydrophyllum. What a lot of other people do is pronounce it so that each syllable has its meaning. So hydrophyllum emphasizes the meaning of water leaves. So of course, hydro, but phyll means leaves. And so when you say hydrophyllum, and that can be really useful. And I finally looked up the other day, I actually had a hiking friend ask me why, and they're water leaves because some of the species have the white marbling, which looks like they've had a water stain on them. One recommendation, and I was actually really fortunate to go to a botanical congress in China, the last one that was held, and we had a wonderful field trip with 2 or 3 Chinese botanists. And of course, we have people from all over the world. And so our accents were getting in the way. And if we looked at them blankly when we said, "What is that?" and they told us, and if they couldn't get the word across, they would whip out their phones and show us the written Latin name in writing. Oh, that's what you're saying. So whether we are saying the name the same or not, we still have this common name that we can at least look at. And that's actually a really good technique if you're having trouble verbally. So Spanish and Italian are the closest to Latin, and most sophisticated people who want to sound sophisticated speakers will pronounce the vowels as you would in Spanish, or most of them. So most of us pronounce the I as though it was an E, but most of us, and I actually have spent much of my career working with the pines, and so the genus name is Pinus. And if I pronounce that with a long E, there's an unfortunate homonym, which you will hear some English speakers doing, either to be funny or to be globally aware. So pronunciation, no wrong way, just say them. It just doesn't matter. So species names are always binomials. And that's, again, a fancy word saying the species name always has 2 words. So you always have a genus and you always have an epithet. The genus is always a noun, so that's easy. And I'm not going to cover much grammar because I'm going to make the point to you that as the person who's driving the car, not learning how to engineer it, you do not need to learn Latin grammar. I'm going to give you a couple of tidbits that will help you recognize why things are the way they are. But you don't, unless you're publishing the species yourself, you don't have to learn the grammar. The species epithet, the second word, works like a modifying adjective. And the reason that we in the ivory tower call it an epithet is technically they're not always adjectives. There's some other parts of speech. And I'm going to tell you that if you think of it as a descriptor, and you can use the word adjective in your brain if you like, it works just fine. So the genus name is always capitalized, always in italics. The epithet is not capitalized in italics, and you will see in older publications epithets that were proper nouns, so either named after a person or after a geographic region, were capitalized. And we don't consider that wrong. It's just not done now. And we'll come back and talk about the author later. So binomial, Helianthus annuus, the common sunflower, two-word binomial. Now, the rules for how to do the names are set by the International Code of Nomenclature. The organization changed its name a few decades ago. And those rules apply to all the plants, including the algae, and also to fungus, just because the mycologists had been sharing that for a long time, that naming system. Animal and bacteria also use Latin names, but slightly different rules. And so you will see some differences in how those names are done. And there are some separate rules for cultivated plants that add on to the binomials. And I will give you a little bit of information in a few slides. So the genus, the plural is genera. So one genus, two genera, three genera, four genera. I already told you it was always capitalized. It's proper to abbreviate the genus after first use. So if I have Helianthus annuus and H. divaricatus were present at this site, notice that this H abbreviation is also capitalized in italics. So if you're actually writing something and you want to be correct, that's the way you're supposed to do it. If the paragraph or your list includes two genera that start with an H, so for example, Heracleum and Helianthus, you would write Hel annuus, Hel divaricatus, Her absinicum, and Her aconitifolium. Okay, so genus, always capitalized, always in italics. The epithet, you want to, if you want your list to be useful or your paragraph to be useful, use exactly as it was most recently published. In other words, don't try to correct the Latin grammar. And I'll try to explain how that works in a couple of slides. It's chosen to agree in gender and number with the genus. And that just means that because Latin, like Spanish, has masculine, feminine, and singular and plural, the ending agrees. And so it's always italicized, should not be capitalized modern. Now, here's the tricky part. If a publication moves the species to another genus, for example, someone says, these 12 species were lumped together, they should be split into these 7 species that keep the original genus, these 5 should go into this other genus. The epithet for each of those 5 travels with it, but the epithet is adjusted by the author who's doing that to agree with the new genus name. So when I said use it exactly as most recently published, it's that the gender and number are supposed to agree, with the caveat that there are rules for how names that people really like can be grandfathered in. And some of those have to be voted on once every 6 years, and none of you care about that. And I don't have the patience to sit through their sessions. I went to the Congress and didn't go to those nomenclatural sessions where people vote on those types of things. But there are some reasons, and it has to do with grammar and it has to do with widely used names. And so sometimes you're going to bump into an epithet that sure looks like it doesn't agree in gender, and it has to do with the fact that the name came from Greece, so it really is singular or something. So there's some strange things that go on. But all you have to do to be someone who can read and understand and use a name is to know that you use it the way it was published. It's really important to get the idea that epithets don't stand alone. So here's an example. Macrophyllum, and if you'll notice, I said hydrophyllum, and that's what I always say. But every time I see this epithet, I say macrophyllum, because that's the way I learned it. And you could say macrophyllum if you prefer. And what that means is that it has big leaves compared to others in this genus. So here's another tidbit for you. If this was published in 1858, and at the time it had the largest leaves known in that genus, if new species are later discovered that are placed in that genus that have even bigger leaves, this name doesn't change. So it's not cast in stone. And that's also really important if you look at geography. So for example, if something is named after Southern Africa, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the only place. The person who named it that might have thought that that was the most important thing about it. So macrophyllum means big compared to others in this genus. And so the other thing that the implication for this is if you have something with a 2 millimeter long leaf and it has the name the epithet macrophyllum, it may be that the other species have even smaller leaves. So it's just in relationship. And then again, it was as first published. So some of the modifiers are very, very popular. Remember, I told you 386,000 or so species. Gracilis, meaning slender, is the winner with 646 species. Angustifolia, narrow leaves, in 529. Elegans in 499. Many epithets honor a person or refer to a geographic location. So here's a couple examples. I'm going to give you a moment to look at these. And some of you, of course, probably know all of these. I'd like you to think about how many of these you would recognize just because you're an English speaker who recognizes root words. I'm going to point out a couple of things. I put them in red here that will be helpful. So A might mean the opposite of. So you know that call, C-A-U-L, is calline, means stem. So calline leaves or the stem leaves. Acaulis means stem leaves. But the A in affinis does not mean the opposite. That's part of the word. And I can't give you any easy grammatical rules to recognize that, but sometimes the A can be meaning the opposite. A lot of root words are reused a lot. So crass meaning thick, and we think of that as the way we use crass in English. So crassifolius meaning thick leaves, but crassipes, thick-footed. So once you learn a few root words, then you can be empowered. So a couple more examples. Latifolius, meaning broad-leaved. Millifolius, many leaves. Parvifolius, small-leaved. And the same things, examples with anthus, meaning flowers. So leucanthus white, micranthus small. Oh, I miss macranthus large. So that, and parviflorus. Parviflorus, meaning flower. So parviflorus versus parvifolius. I wanted to just point out too that knowing the root word can be really helpful. So if the genus is feminine, it would be nana, and if it's masculine, it would be nanus. And so if you learn nan is dwarf, you will know many more epithets. So infraspecific. So intraspecific, technically, when used correctly, means between species. Intra meaning between two things. Infra means inside of. And so in the rules of ICN, names can actually be published as either subspecies or varieties. And there are some tendencies, but what most botanists do is if a certain family or genus, people have been naming things as subspecies, that's what a newly discovered infraspecific would be named. So the important thing here is these are actually established, unique entities. This does not mean the variation within the species. This is actually carrying a name, and there's some implications for that. For example, depending on how the Endangered Species Act is written. So here's some examples of just how you would use that in reading and writing. So if there were 3 named varieties, there would also be a typical variety, and that's based on the types of the species. And I'm going to come back to that in a couple of slides. So Erica calycina, variety calycina, and that would be the type variety. So Erica calycina, variety calycina is the type or typical variety. And there's also variety fragrans, variety paraplaciflora, and variety decidiflora. And actually, there are in the book, I go into some more details about the proper way to abbreviate those once they've been used once. And the same thing, same set of rules work for subspecies. So you have a typical subspecies, and then you have this. And this way you abbreviate this, SUB, SP is important. And I'll give you in another slide or so an explanation of why that's important. There's some conflicts. So subspecies is abbreviated SUB, SP. They're not in italics in the taxon names, which is really annoying when you're doing word processing. You have to go back and grab each piece to put it in italics, but that's not correct to put the word, the abbreviation VAR and the abbreviation SUBSP should not be in italics. I wanted to mention taxon. So by definition, taxon means a name at every level or any level in the hierarchy. And I'll show you an example of a hierarchy later also. But in common usage, what you will likely read is it's used for species and infraspecific. So say, for example, there are these named varieties. You would say for Erica taxa in the first example, which just saves time and paper over saying one species with 4 varieties. So you're just saying at any level, taxa is just you're counting named entities. So taxon and taxa. Authors. So I'll give you an example again soon, but a valid publication is required to create a scientific name. And that's actually been true going back. We've tightened the rules substantially about what was considered a valid publication. It used to be, that colonialists who took seed back to Europe and published a name in a seed catalog, we are still using many of those names today. There were no descriptions other than what you would do to try to sell the plant. So, but what we do in the present day is require a publication with a full description. So, by ICN rules, the author who named the species, the person who created that name, is included with the formal name. The formal name is there without it. So the reason for this is twofold. So first of all, there were many accidentally duplicated names, many, many, many of these, and it easily happened. No printing presses, ships slowly crossing the ocean, 2 different people chose the same name, something macrophyllum within the same genus for 2 totally different species on different continents. What it did, though, is if you think about how scientific papers do citations, so every time you have something that needs to be cited, there's that separate section at the end with your literature cited and you give all the details. If what the author in the name says is you as the reader have to go figure out where and in what journal or in what book this author published this species name. If you want to know that, I'm not going to include that in the list. So it continues as a built-in citation. Most journals, this is not true outside of botany so much. The animal folks and some of the other disciplines are more lenient. They still require the author name the first time the scientific name is used, and then you drop it. I'm going to tell you that for most of what you do, if you're, say, for example, you're doing species lists at a local area, a park, for example, you can just omit the author names altogether. What happens is that these have all been sorted out. So the flora that you're using, the guidebooks you're using, are using the one that's the common one, and people know which one that is. And so if with the author, you do not put that author in italics. And it's interesting if you ever just want to look something up about a name, the abbreviations are standardized. There's this web page called IPNI, International Plant Name.org, and they maintain a list of all the published species names. And one of the things they do is they would tell you exactly how to abbreviate an author like Linnaeus. And he is, by the way, the only author to have a 1-letter abbreviation because of the nearly 6,000 species. And he actually, before this was a rule, violated the unwritten code of conduct. He loved Linnea borealis so much that he named this genus after himself. And it's considered in very bad taste to name a species after yourself. And I'm actually not aware of anyone else who's done it that survived. And so, for example, Pinus maximinoi was published by H.E. Moore. Notice there are no species. That's one of the rules. You're supposed to put them all together. It makes it a little bit more tidy. And there are many botanists named Moore. So Harold Emery Moore's species have exactly those initials. So if you really need to look something up and you have the full name, you could look at IPNM. So that's a tidbit for those of you who are planning on doing some writing. So here's a few useful abbreviations. I have some more complete explanations in the book. I thought I would give you a couple that are important. I want to start down here with SP. So in Latin, the word species is abbreviated SP period. So the way you would use this is if you had, making a list, and you had a species of oak, and you didn't have what you needed to make a determination about which species. Say, for example, all the leaves were gone in the winter, or you didn't have the acorns, you could write Quercus sp. And by the way, botanists usually pronounce this spa. So Quercus spa. You can pronounce it however you like. That means you're unsure which species. The correct Latin way to make a plural of species is SPP. So when you see Quercus SPP, also usually pronounced spa, you mean several species of oaks. Don't know which ones they were, or you would have used the full name, but that's Quercus spa. And notice again, when it's the subspecies, because of that confusion, we write out SUB-SP, not just SUB, and VAR period when they're part of the scientific name. SL for sensu lato and sensu stricto, meaning the most broad, if someone has changed, how broadly a name should apply. And one thing I'll point out here, the hybrid symbol is actually a multiplication symbol. And I'm going to talk about hybrids in just a moment. So hybrids, the multiplication sign is the technically correct way to do it, but if you're typing or you don't feel like finding the symbol in word processing, a lowercase x will be understood. It's actually proper to omit the space, but you will see sometimes with a space. So if someone recognizes an common enough and widespread enough hybrid and thinks it just should have a useful name, it could be named, for example, amulons. And if that's done, the correct way is italics, the multiplication symbol, no space, italics. So the other way to do this is that, and I'm going to use the word putative here because in nature, most of the hybrids we find, we're making a pretty good educated guess about who the parents were. And what you do is you put the two of them in alphabetical order because we often don't know who was the seed parent and who was the pollen parent. So this is not the way the plant breeders or the animal breeders would do something. Just alphabetical order: Verbascum lignitis, X the nigrum. So that's how hybrids are named. And these are natural hybrids. And I'll talk about cultivated plants coming up. So family name. The ICN rule is that you add this really long suffix to the first genus that was published. So for example, because aster was early in the alphabet and Linnaeus included it in his species of the planet, the family name is Asteraceae. Pinus, we dropped the US, but again, you don't have to know that. You can just look up how to spell the name, Pinaceae. This rule, I actually remember learning, I'll date myself, but I was learning taxonomy before that rule had been put into place. There were some traditional names that were being used, and some of them were so popular that they're still officially recognized. So they're not incorrect to use. So I'll give you a couple that you'll see in, especially older flora, but you will still see other people using them. Umbelliferae is an alternate name for the Apiaceae, and that's because of those umbels of umbels. So umbellifery is actually kind of a nice name. Palmae, the palm family. The problem is there are a couple of genera that have family named after them that have only a couple of syllables different. And so this Barik ACE is really hard to say. So the palm people prefer palmy. Compositae you'll hear because of the heads of many small flowers. You'll hear a lot of the ag people still calling the Brassicaceae the crucifery. And that came from a nickname of crucifer for the cross-shaped flowers. Of course, you'll hear a lot about the legumes, and a lot of, again, agricultural people will use the family name as Leguminosae. And notice this ending is just AE, and that's when this was being done this way. And then, of course, Labati. And there's actually a couple more, but those are actually technically still legal and depends on the journal's policy, but should be allowed. Let's talk about how this a new species would be named. This is fairly recent, 2000. I'm dating myself if I think 22 years ago is recent. This was a Hawaiian Shedia, which is in the Caryophyllaceae, that only has 5 fertile stamens. And this was a really interesting paper just because it was, I'll show you the examples. The American Journal of Botany is a peer-reviewed journal, which of course means that when you submit a manuscript to them, it's sent out for probably anonymous reviews. People can sign the reviews if they wanted. Then the journal editor makes a decision about whether to publish the paper with based on those reviewers' recommendations. And I will tell you that if the reviewer thinks there's a problem with the new name that's being chosen, they might comment on that. But it's really the author of the paper, and if it's published, agreed to be published by the editor, who lets that name be created. And then we'll talk later about how or why Flora may or may not decide to pick that up and start actually using it. It's required that the species has an author's name. So in this case, Warren Wagner and Elizabeth Harris wrote the paper. The species name is by W.L. Wagner and E. Harris. And you might actually have someone else writing the publication, but giving authorship to someone else, for example, if someone had been deceased, for example. And they use this little abbreviation SPNOV, species novum. That means this is here being created. This name is here being created. The diagnosis is absolutely required. And what the diagnosis is how this new species differs from the other species. And the most closely related one is Shedia pubescens. And this one is in Latin. And basically what the important thing it says is it is different from pubescens in that half of the stamens differentially abort. And I'll show you a great scanning electron micrograph they have of that. Under new rules, by the way, because around the world, more people are comfortable with English than they are with Latin, you can now do this diagnosis in English if you choose. So here's a little bit more about that. What has to be designated when you publish a species is a type herbarium specimen. So one herbarium specimen, pressed, dried, glued, filed in a very special cabinet because those are valuable specimens. In this case, this specimen, the type specimen that they're designated, was collected on Oahu, and it was collected by Steve Weller and Ann Sakai, and there's the information about their collection. And the abbreviation US is part of a standard list of abbreviations. That's the Smithsonian Institution. The rules for a new species also require an illustration. So they had a botanical artist draw this. And this paper, this is not required. They had this wonderful SEM that shows how they start out with 10 nubbins, like every other species in this genus has 10 stamens, and then half of them abort, so there are only 5. So that's how a new species is published. So who decides which published names to accept? Well, so not everyone's going to agree for a new or changed name. And then the other problem is, even if they agree, I have bookshelves full of flora that were printed a few decades ago, and many of those names are out of date. I suggest if you're working, wanting to make species lists, choose an authority. If you're working worldwide, for example, you really want to have your life list include species from other places in the world. Kew in England or in Great Britain has a world checklist of vascular flora. Let me see. I'm not sure if that's plants or flora. I need to look at that. I have it bookmarked on my browser, but at any rate, this is really a clearinghouse for the experts on each plant to do that. And so if you want to go get the latest list and download it as a spreadsheet, you can do that. Or you can just choose a local flora, and especially if your state has had a more recent one. One of the things I wanted to do was let you know about the word synonym. So dictionary definition of synonym, but that's not what it means at all. Not at all. And what it means is it's wrong. And the reason it's a synonym, the word synonym is still used, is that what we're saying is that the synonym is the same thing as that other thing, so don't use this name. So if you find lists of synonyms, those are not currently accepted species names, at least according to whoever made that list. So a synonym could be something like a validly published name that violated ICN rules. So for example, they accidentally duplicated some prior name, or much more common, it was moved to a different genus. That's happening still. Or people who are studying now with more thorough methods say, no, that's just variation. Put that in a common garden, take that short statured little one from the ridgetop and you plant it in a common garden, it grows up nice and tall, right? So that sometimes names just get abandoned. So they might have be currently not considered a separate species. This organization I mentioned before, the International Plant Names Index, in addition to searching for authors, you can trace to the accepted names. So you can search for a synonym and it will point you to the accepted name. Q does the same thing. And of course, if you want to be thorough about this with a group, you will find some cases where Q and IPNI don't exactly agree. But for the most part, things are settling down. So we've been talking about natural plants that evolved on their own. The Cultivated Plant Code, there are a couple of good books. I didn't put them in the slideshow, my book, and you can find them on your own. There are a couple of really good publications that tell you how to go about naming a cultivated plant that you develop. And that's not what I'm trying for here. I just want you to recognize the names. So what there is an international code of nomenclature for cultivated plants. It's just a set of rules. And what you do is you add to the binomial. So the binomial, the species name, is established under ICN rules. And what they add usually is a cultivar. The word cultivar it's actually not the word contraction. There's a fancy word for Kathmandu or something, but of cultivated variety. So cultivar is a cultivated variety. And then the ICNCP has other rules for groups. The Dutch iris folks and the orchid people have all sorts of complex things. So what happens is you have Malus domestica, which is the apple. The golden delicious in single apostrophes is the cultivar name. And if there's not a known species, so for example, some of these were developed very complex hybridization, and they are just given a cultivar name on top of the genus. Same thing with the daylilies, the Hemerocallis stella de oro. And the cultivar name, again, moves with the name change. So here's an example of Solanum lycopersicum, the tomato, versus the synonym Lycopersicon. And the black brandywine cultivar name moved with it. I'm just going to mention that no single source curates all those cultivar names. However, some herbaria, some local big university herbaria will keep type specimens because they, for example, Oregon State has some cultivars being developed there. The other thing is different groups. So the iris folks have an organization that curates all those cultivars so that you don't accidentally duplicate those names. And then on top of this, there are a bunch of legal protections, copyright and trademark type things that are on top of this. And they differ country by country. So I'm not going to try to cover that for you now. But I think it's really helpful to recognize the single apostrophe and the name not in italics is a cultivar. I wanted to just kind of back up because I have you as a captive audience and I love systematics and phylogenies. I think one of the ivory tower things we do is banty around a lot of words that anyone who hasn't, I was going to say hasn't gone to school recently, but that's actually not true. I think that more high school biology and college biology programs are not doing as thorough a job teaching this as they did in the past. Vascular plants. So the definition of a vascular plant is a land plant that has lignified, so woody transport cells. So those are the ones with xylem. And here on this tree of life for the land plants is the node, and a node on a tree is a branching point. And that infers the common ancestor of all vascular plants. So the lycophytes, which you may know, the ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. And the other way of saying saying vascular plants is land plants that are not bryophytes. And the bryophytes, of course, are the mosses, hornworts, and liverworts that are there. So the reason I wanted to say that is I think when you're thinking about using only common names, one of the ways you might inspire people to think about the value of having one and only one name. A lot of plant species have very broad ranges. So for example, all of North America and Northern Europe, or the tropics, both Old World and New World. Those types of things are not that uncommon. When you think about how many taxa there are, it becomes overwhelming to only use common names, and it's really limiting. So there are over 500,000 photosynthetic taxa. And so a lot of this, of course, there's a lot of algal species that are unnamed. So that's 72,000 is not as many as there are. But at any rate, of that 500,000, 386,000 are vascular plants. And if you take out the lycophytes and ferns and there's quite a few species of ferns, but the angiosperms themselves are somewhere around 371,000. So having one name for one species really helps us talk with people in other parts. And especially, even if the native range doesn't extend, now that we have weeds moving all over the continent, if you want to know more about that weed species, it can be really helpful to know use the same name for that species as places where it grows naturally. So I want to tell you about the angiosperms and how that works. So there's a group called APG. It's an angiosperm phylogeny group. And they published a really, really helpful paper, and I'm going to show you a poster in a moment. When I was a student, and I refused to make my students memorize this, but we memorized this kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and that's still useful. Those are all nested levels. Each one is nested within that. What the angiosperm phylogeny group said, with all of these, as we understand the history of common ancestors of plants, they're really useful. They decided to keep names that were popular, right? Because we know them and they do make sense. And so what they did is they named Embryophyta, Tracheophyta, and Spermophyta. So 3 nested layers, land plants, vascular plants, and just the seed plants, all named with the phyta name. And they did that because those are useful names. And then, of course, the other thing I'm going to mention is the order, which is ALES, is the suffix that you'll use for that, is a very useful organizing concept. And turns out that there are some biochemical as well as cool seed dispersal mechanisms and other reasons that the orders are of interest to us. And what I wanted to just mention to you, because if you have an option, there is this poster, and you're not going to be able to read anything on here. But what I am going to tell you is you can download this for free. It's a beautiful PDF. It's designed to print on a big poster. So what are they, 3 feet by 4 feet, whatever those are. If you printed it on 8.5 by 11, you would not be able to read it. But if you download it as a PDF, you could go zoom in and read it. It's beautiful. It's useful. You'll learn a lot about how the flowering plants were done. If you happen to have access to a color poster printer somewhere, or maybe someone who knows you and loves you has access to one at work they wouldn't get fired for using. I used to work in a forestry department that had a beautiful poster printer for maps, and they would have let me print this. And so that type of thing, it would make a really nice addition to a wall somewhere. So one of the things I wanted to just show you is that I think it's really important to not let the ivory tower take over. So in our understanding of evolution, what became really clear, this orange arrow right here on the tree is monocots. So all of the ones in this group here on the tree from this branch on are monocots. And so what we now know, though, is that the dicots, some of them branched off earlier. This is the magnolias and the laurels and some of those families. The rest of the dicots are on this branch here. And we know that that's common ancestor, common ancestor, common ancestor. So monocot, the proper way to say that is renders the dicots paraphyletic. In other words, the dicots don't share. But it is still really useful to divide a guidebook into monocots and dicots, because the monocots are really distinctive and you can narrow the list a lot. And so these are the types of decisions that are made, even if we understand things are happened in a different way. There's some notes in the book about, for example, how we know that nitrogen fixation evolved on which branches of the tree, and some of the cool reasons that this type of knowledge can be used and help develop our understanding. So I want to wrap it up and make sure I have some time for questions. I have an ISBN. You can find this on Amazon. If you give me feedback, that would be wonderful. I am going to improve the formatting. The self-publishing is tough. I didn't have someone else to make it quite as pretty as I would like. I want to say that I really appreciate your enthusiasm for plants. But there's probably a couple of people in the audience who are saying, that's all nice. I'm going to keep calling them by whatever name I want. And that's just fine, because I'm going to tell you that my husband and I, for more than 35 years, we know exactly what we mean when he says, those pretty pink flowers we grew by the front door of our house in Reading. He knows exactly what plant that is. He recognizes it in the wild. He doesn't care that it's called Rhododendron occidentalis. And he doesn't care that other people call it Western azalea even. And so I still love him anyway, and we can communicate about those just fine. Again, those resources to translate synonyms, the WCVP, it is the World Checklist of Vascular Plants, not Flora. That must mean that they're not just doing flowering plants. And IPNI, the International Plant Name Index. And that gives you the background on the authors. And with that, I'm going to stop and thank you all so much for those of you who stayed with me. And I'm going to figure out how I get into the chat so that I can see your questions.
Thank you, Anne. Excuse me. Thank you, Anne. I'm going to check chat here and okay, I don't think there's any questions yet. I'm going to suggest
college botany, yes.
College botany, yes. Very interesting, Anne. Very interesting. We have our own book, our identification book for plants of Tennessee. And I noticed that Dennis Horn isn't on, but this is the book. And I'm assuming that we probably did use some kind of naming system or checklist system of some type. Bart, do you know how we did that? Have you been around long enough with it?
Yeah, it was, the names were decided basically following the Atlas names that they had at the Austin P when they did the Atlas part. It was a 3-part project that was designated by the Tennessee legislature. And so they had an Atlas, which Austin P did. We did the Wildflower Field Guide and also the checklist. But the names were basically agreed upon by, I think, Dr. Chester, basically, and the people at the state. Of course, things have changed a lot since then too. But the new vascular flora that was published a few years ago is probably the standard for Tennessee now.
Okay.
And of course, I will just say that even I have some very old flora on my shelves, places that I, have that maybe have not published anymore. You can still use that and then just double check, translate the synonym. So cinnamon, I must be getting hungry. Time for dessert. Yeah. So even if the name is technically wrong, it's still the same. There's some times when things have been split or lumped, and you learn a lot by tracing the synonyms.
Right. And at the beginning, when we did our book, everybody was using Astor still, and we decided that we wanted to go ahead and use Astor because it would be more familiar for people, even though Symphiatricum had basically replaced that at that point, and everybody was in the scientific world was accepting that. So, but that was just a choice we made just because it was a book that was designed more for the amateur than it was for the professional botanist.
Sure. No, I think those are important decisions, and people protecting what they know and love is really important. And anyone who wants to talk to people outside can easily translate that. I understand those decisions a lot.
Yeah.
Someone did, I wasn't sure if you wanted to curate these, but someone asked, where do we find that poster in the PDF format? I think if you just Google APG4, and I'm not sure whether you use the Roman numeral 4 or IV, try both ways and just say angiosperm phylogeny group. Let me just see if I can do that. APG4 angiosperm phylogeny group. And if you have to dink around a little bit, but somewhere they have that download. I think I put a more direct link in the book, but yeah, it's a beautiful poster.
Okay. One comment is, just bought your book for my PhD son and myself.
Well, thank you. And I will really appreciate any feedback, because I do think that not having an editor, there will certainly be, when I was getting ready to do the slideshow today, I saw that I had a typo in my table of epithets. It's, instead of being of the fields, it was off the fields. Oh dear, I didn't catch that.
None of us is perfect. One comment is, thank you for that informative talk. I learned a lot despite not needing to be sold on using scientific names. So it was good.
And I see that someone just put in a link to the poster.
Okay, good. As a garden writer, I want to say a big thank you, a job well done. Okay.
And I actually have another, this is just a personal mission of mine. Whenever you see someone trying to abandon the italics, I think we should all write to their editor, whether it's an online news posting source or a local newspaper. And the reason is that we don't need the ivory tower gets in the way, but in some cases, dumbing it down, you lose the, it's not really clear. Mm-hmm. And so those italics jump out of the page at you, and that someone is actually using that purposefully. And I think it makes communication clearer. And I'm not particularly worried about someone getting the VAR period in italics. Also, that kind of error is just, that's fine. If you read my book, you realize I make errors. But I do think that teaching, even in high school, I would love also if someone would inspire a local high school biology teacher to teach a simplified version of this. I think it's just science literacy.
Thank you. Another comment, I didn't realize how often names are changed or updated. So this was enlightening, Anne.
Yeah, and actually, I was told more than 20 years ago that the pace of name changes was slowing down, and it's not so. Because new information is coming in, new studies are coming on. And so I do think that the pace has not yet slowed of name changes.
One comment was, as a new master gardener, very helpful.
Oh, good.
And another is, social media is the enemy of retaining italics.
That's true. And I actually never have figured out how to do italics on my phone. So if I'm using my phone, yeah, no, I agree. And you know, again, that's fine. I have a daughter-in-law who uses correct grammar in every text message. But even if that having no italics in a text message or in social media wouldn't bother me at all. But if it's actually a written story based on someone's research, I think it would be useful. But there's different types of writing. And you're welcome to disagree about any of that.
We've had a series of newsletter editors over the last few years, since we had one very, very competent one in at one point, and since then we've had a series of them, including myself, and we're nowhere up to speed up on the standards for naming, and this has been a big help. We have a new editor who's coming on with our next issue, so I'm going to make sure she takes a look at this.
Well, you know, I have to say, I was an active member of one of the chapters of the California Native Plant Society, and this is one of those agree to disagree issues. Two very good friends of mine who led the field hikes for many years absolutely adamantly refused to have people use scientific names on the hikes, because they wanted to get those other folks in who would be intimidated by that. And so, you know, they don't object when someone in the newsletter uses both common name and whatever, but they, you know, it was really important to them. And I think they have a really good point that on the hike, you know, people who are brand new to learning plants, you know, you definitely don't want to scare them off. But if you get someone who is down that slippery slope, having to understand at least so that they're literate about it, I think would be really helpful. So,
yeah, and when we do our newsletter reports on the field trips, we try and include both names. We're going to have to work a little harder at that, I think, but yeah.
So the question about the opinion on styling common names with initial caps versus lowercase, I really don't. I think if it were me, I would put the common names in some type that made it stand out as a name, so that you were being clear that it wasn't yellow daisy as in one of the 1,000 of the composite family that's yellow, but you actually were using, you know, yellow daisy as a name. So at least if you're going to use common names, you know, that's what I would do. But I don't have a strong opinion about that.
Good question. Thank you, Toby, for asking that one. That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, it may just be that we saw several different kinds of yellow daisies, and we didn't have the time to figure out what any of them were, which is what I never don't know.
Yes, yes. Excuse me. Any other questions? If so, please speak up. Anyone with a question, you're welcome to unmute and speak up. And if not, I am going to say, Anne, thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for inviting
This has
me.
been enlightening. It's going to help on many levels for me personally. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. Personally, it's been very informative, very helpful, and I think because we are such a variety of people in a variety of professions, and using our science skills in a variety of ways, that this will be helpful for many.
Well, thank you
So
very much.
thank you, and I'm going to say
Thank you
good
very
night.
much. Thank you. Good
And
night.
Thank you for
having me.
coming in. We look forward to maybe hearing from you again sometime.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.